Well, like most books in the Bible, Ezekiel's written a long time ago. And I always get kind of touched by that whole idea, the whole concept, because it just doesn't seem like things would be around and still be useful that would be that old. I mean, to me, if I read a book that's a couple hundred years old, then I'm thinking, wow, this is really out of touch with reality. But when we're reading and studying the books that we call the prophets, we need to think about what we're trying to do. There's a lot of really interesting stories. I mean, some of the ways that God instructed Ezekiel to teach a lesson. I don't know how many of you read far enough ahead, but where he's told to, he sees a hole and then he digs out the hole, and then you kind of think, well, what's that going to be used for? And then what happens is that he's trying to prepare the people, and maybe they'll get the hint that we're going to have to leave. And so he packs his bag and he walks around, and people look at him, I guess. There's no real observations there that are noted. But what happens is then he comes back, and that's where he spends the night. And the whole idea is that maybe the people will see that we're going to have to go on a trip here, and it's going to be our leap into captivity. Hang on a second here. It's interesting that I think Robert made a comment about, hang on a second here. Well, when I left them here this afternoon, right there, it was working fine. Let's see. Question, is it on? It may be, or it may not be. Okay. Sorry about that one. Okay. Did you leave me dangling up here long enough, Scott? Anyway, I won't stand here and stare at him while he's working on it. I know that can be very detaching. They go into captivity because of what? Because they're sinful people. God always said, if you be obedient to me, then I will take care of you, and life will be good. But if you don't, then you're going to be removed from the land. They've already been removed from the land, at least the northern half, and then also You're gonna tell me how you did it? That's the thing about Scott. You don't get much out of him unless you ask. Thanks, Scott. Ezekiel was given the title of being a watchman, and that was a person who was to look out for the welfare of the city. But there was also a philosophical or a spiritual aspect of it where he's watching out for sin and he's trying to protect the people. The city is eventually, city being what? Jerusalem. They're going to be besieged and eventually be, for the most part, taken off into Babylon. Now, where is Ezekiel when he's writing this, by the way? He's writing it over in Babylon because he's already over there with a group. And they have lying prophets, and so that is done in a way. We're just not going to have time to go back over all of this. But they deserve judgment. Though said among idolatrous peoples, Jerusalem rebelled more than others. Verse 5 and 6. So what's the principle there? You know, when you hang around people who aren't right or aren't good people, I guess there is that principle that bad company corrupts good morals. But how did they top out the whole thing? They were worse than the people who were around them. And so when you try to figure out what's important to God, you don't get a lot of discussion here about how they didn't do things right in the temple. I'm certain they probably did. I think they become very thoughtless, but it's not discussed. For the most part, they were very ruthless people. They had become very much individuals who were rough and tough and took advantage of people. But what was their principal sin? Idolatry. That was their principal sin. And so that's the one, I think, if you're trying to figure out well, what's the most offensive to God? Well, at least in the prophets, what you're reading about is they turn away from God. And the first thing we read about early was how they were worshiping some of the same gods that were being worshipped by the people who were there. Now, how do you feel about that? How does that strike you when you hear that that's what they're doing? Is this sort of getting you to get into the touchy-feely stuff here? No, I mean, think about it. What were they always supposed to do? Worship only God. And these people who had that drilled within them from their childhood, they do what? They end up worshiping other gods. And so when you start thinking about, well, what causes people to go into sin and rebel? What things are they going to do? You know, generally speaking, that's not one of those things that you and I worry about. You know, I don't know about any of you who are worshiping idols. I mean, I suppose theoretically you might have some in your house. When we're in the Philippines, you'll find that occasionally in some homes. But it always amazes me that when they are told, this is what I want you to be. I want you to be a kind of people who separate yourself from those around you. One way to do that is to not worship their gods, and they do it. I noted with you before that they actually committed cannibalism. I'm just not even sure how you even say that, you know, if you're a cannibal, how you put it in the correct verbiage. But when you read that, do you think about when might that, in your mind, now this is going to sound kind of gross to you, but when might that be acceptable? Yeah, Lupe? Yeah. Yeah, okay, so there's a situation. And so you can really imagine that maybe when things got really bleak in town, that may be something that they turn to. It doesn't really say, though. It doesn't try to give any shining light to it. It just says they ate their children. And you don't even read that much about the idolatrous people. But the way they're going to be judged is very strictly. Most of us think of God as a loving God and want to see Him as a God who's careful and graceful with us. But what you find here is God is going to be very strict with these people. And don't let yourself fall into the trap of saying, well, Randy, this is the Old Testament. God's attitude towards sin is always the same. Water, please. Actually, there's some down there, but there's some in there, Kitty. These sins were were very, very serious what they were doing. And one of the things is that they end up being very thoughtless people. That's one of the things that I've noticed. If you go through and you read what it is God condemns, they were kind of smug, they were kind of smart alecky. Thank you. And that's included in God's reprimanding them. So, thank you, Kenny, again. So those are the things that God's rebuking and saying, because of these things, this is why you have to leave the land. All right. Let's get up to our area where we're supposed to be. Now that's a new one. The destruction that they're going to receive is that they're going to lose the land. And the land is actually described as something that's going to be destroyed. But the point is, even though the language is so strong, as you'll note here, that they have the person who's dressed in white linen. Does anybody know about that person and what they were supposed to be doing? Or what she or he was supposed to be doing? I can't hear. Yeah, go around town and find the people who are still moaning about how bad we are. And give them a mark, because I'm going to show them grace. And then the people who don't get the mark, then they're the ones who for sure are going to be reprimanded, and many of them will be killed. And the way God approaches it is with the idea that this is fair. Now, what makes it hard about determining whether something's fair or not when we're dealing with God? I mean, we want things to be fair. And when we say that, who's deciding what's fair? Yeah, so that's what's fair to me. Okay. So is that your hand, Rich?
Yeah, I was just going to say, where there could be no sin without law. They were told what to do.
Right.
And they did not do it.
Yeah.
They had their opportunity.
Sure. So it was pretty straightforward, but they were so deep in this whole thing. That's one of the reasons why God sent Ezekiel to say, this is over, it's done. I'm not going to mess with you anymore. You're out of here. So it is because they were doing a lot of things. But again, the things were a little bit more far-reaching in culture. And that is, he doesn't really talk a whole lot about what the people did in the temple. It's hardly ever mentioned, at least as you go through the prophets. It's really about things which are moral things and things that, if not really done properly, mess up society. Go ahead, Robert.
On that question you were asking about fairness, like Richard said, they had a law. There was a law that it was unequivocal what the deal was from the time of the founding of Israel to Moses to before that with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Keep my law, keep my statutes, keep my commandments, or else. And they are now experiencing the or else. And for generations this has been going this way. And it's hard for us to think in terms of generations, and it's hard for us to think in terms too far outside of our immediate circumstances. Whereas when you're dealing with God, He's looking at what is fair, what is right, what is correct, based on really criteria that is extremely hard for us to even think on the level that God thinks as far as
Right.
a scale.
Yeah, we have to understand that oftentimes we don't understand God and why He's doing something, why He's soft here and why He's hard there. And so it's important for us to understand that God is the one who determines what's fair, and we have to accept that. Now, why is it people who reject God, generally, let's just say atheists in our culture, why would that be a problem for them? Well, they don't believe God. In fact, their idea of God is it's my God. It's the God that I have, because my ability to decide what's right and wrong is just as good as Charlie's or Dana's, or just as good as God is. But that's really not true. So the prophesying, his going around, he's generally going to be doing what? Giving inspiring sermons? No. I mean, hopefully somebody gets inspired when he talks, but it's not really that inspiring. He's condemning them. And just about everything that looks like a sermon. And generally speaking, I'll say this to you, that a lot of times what we see is, this is what God's told him to say. And it's kind of like, thus saith the Lord. But it's very point blank with Ezekiel. And he's actually doing what we believe when the apostles got the Holy Spirit and they were told that they were going to be able to have the answers when the problems came. And that's going to be because the Spirit of God is with them. Well, this is actually the way it's presented in the Scriptures. It just says, and this is what God said. Generally speaking, if we know a person's a prophet, what do we expect? We expect him to be speaking the truth. All right? But this emphasizes it. It's not just, okay, I've been made a prophet. He says, this is what God wanted me to say. So that's what he's doing. Now, social disruption, military disruption, all this is going to happen. In other words, once the whole thing really begins to fall apart, society is going to be going down the drain. Social side of it, remember, this was one of those things that was kind of interesting because it has to do with inflation, is that he says, you might as well take your money and just throw it out in the street. It's no good. It's not going to do you any good. Because your money's not going to be worth anything. Something to think about. Okay, so political disruption, of course, that would be understandable. But idolatry is centered in for us in chapter 8. Ezekiel is allowed to see the seat of the image of jealousy. I assume that this was the way this particular false god was categorized. No one seems to know exactly what the phrase means. There was the secret animal cult. They worshipped animals. Then there was the Babylonian god or goddess of vegetation or fertility. And then they worshipped the sun. Okay, I'm trying. I want to kind of get a reaction out of you on this. Because a lot of times it's like reading Old Testament stories. You know, we just kind of read along and they're kind of like fantasy. We have a hard time seeing that when we're looking at it, that this is very real, and it's something that really speaks to what was actually going on. Go ahead, Ian. Sure.
Generations have gone on. They felt some effects of that. But yet here they are literally within the temple dedicated to this God.
Yeah.
God Almighty.
Yeah.
And yet they have perverted it to turn it into a pantheon essentially.
All kinds of different things. And Tammuz was one of the idols.
It's like they're ignoring the very being that has allowed them to build the temple that services that same being.
Yeah.
Mind frame for humanity. We can see everything around us. We can experience the goodness of God and yet continually turn our back on Him.
Yeah.
And it's just a strong reminder to all of us what waits if we do fall into that trap.
Because it's not the way it's supposed to be. You know, if you've been taught the right things, then you're supposed to keep on doing what's right. And that's what all of us are responsible to do with our children or with our friends or whatever it may be. But the reality is just like with them, sometimes or many times, people just don't pay any attention. They're not interested. And that must have been what that was all about. They just weren't interested anymore for any assortment of reasons. So 6 men then go forward with weapons meant for the uncaring, disobedient. This is kind of at least the beginning of the taking them out of the land in the writings of Ezekiel. One man goes about putting a mark on those who mourn over the downfall of the nation. And that's who? No. The guy in the what? Yeah, the guy in white linen. See, you didn't catch that, did you? Yeah. I did fold it over a little bit. Maybe most of you were caught up on that. No, remember, it's just one of these things that's fascinating. Okay, you over there with the white shirt, I want you to go around and mark these people. And I'm certain this had to be pretty tedious, what he was doing. If it were me, I think I'd be feeling pretty good about the whole thing, about being able to actually put a mark on somebody and say, you're going to be okay. So it's not all negative. But anyway, we move along here. And one of the things that's also interesting here, when was it that Ezekiel witnessed the glory of God, as it's called? And it's that structure that's really pretty amazing. And it follows around, or it goes along with different people, a little bit like God used to lead the people across the wilderness. But anyway, so where was it that he first met this thing with the... Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry. I saw your hand there, Jeff. You got it kind of right there. Yeah, there you go. Okay, what about it? It shows up. It comes over and shows up over in Jerusalem. Now, obviously, it miraculously gets there. It's not like somebody carries it around like any of the stuff related to the temple. But it was something that was extremely powerful. So let's get up here to where we were supposed to be, according to my instructions. But let's look at Ezekiel 10 and be reminded of this thing. Now, it's there and it's gone. It's there and it's gone. But it was amazing because they called it the glory of the Lord. And now, if you remember how it looks, there is a opening at the top, and it's something where God is there generally looking down on what's going on and what is happening there. But look at chapter 10. Beginning in verse 1. Mark Edwards, could you read it, please? 10, read down through just read verse 1 and 2 to start with.
1 and 2?
Yes.
Then I looked, and behold, in the expanse that was over the heads of the cherubim, something like a sapphire stone, in appearance resembling a throne, appeared above them. And he spoke to the man clothed in linen and said, enter between whirling wheels under the cherubim, and fill your hands with coals of fire from between the cherubim, and scatter them over the city. And he entered in my sight.
Okay, I don't remember it exactly saying it. Here's why I want you to do it. Can you infer from what he's doing? Remember, he's the guy that says, you're going to be okay if I mark you off. But he's told to toss these charcoals around. Now, what might that represent to the people? Or what might it be that God's trying to get the idea of for them is to understand what's going to happen? Okay, there's going to be destruction. I think that's probably a good way of looking at it. It certainly represents the idea of fire, and things are going to be destroyed. It doesn't really, at least when I've been reading this, I haven't read it specifically communicated, but I think that's a reasonable thing for us to believe about it. Now the cherubim were standing on the right side of the temple when the man entered, and the cloud filled the inner courtyard. Does this sound pretty spectacular? Yeah, it is very, very spectacular. Then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub to the threshold of the temple, and the temple was filled with the cloud, and the courtyard was filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord. Moreover, the sound of the wings of the cherubim was heard as far as the outer courtyard, like the voice of God Almighty when He speaks. I never thought of God speaking like that. Or if someone says, oh yeah, it sounds just like the way God talks. So anyway, we've got these cherubs. Now we have seraphim, we have cherubs, and then we have cherubim. What's the difference? Well, cherubim is plural for cherub, so that one's pretty simple. Anyway, we've got these individuals or these people who are angels, a group of angels that in this case are very, very significant in being present when the glory of the Lord is doing what it's intended to do, and that is to impress the people of God's greatness. So, as far as who they are, what a cherub is, and a seraphim is, they're heavenly beings. That's the best I can do for you. So, what happens at the end of this, which is going to teach a lesson to the people, beginning in verse 18. There is the glory of the Lord in presence with the temple, and then what happens? Chapter 10, verse 18 says, Then the glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim. And when the cherubim departed, they lifted their wings and rose from the ground in my sight and with wheels beside them. And they stood still at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house. And the glory of God of Israel hovered over them. These are the living beings that I saw beneath the God of Israel by the river of Chebar. So here's Ezekiel going, wow, I thought that was pretty amazing over there in Babylon. Now it's over here. How did that get here? Well, God took it there or brought it there. And it just appears at times. So it's one of those things that I think you wonder how many ways or different manifestations there are of God. This is amazingly spectacular. This is something that should have really caught someone's attention. This is almost like right out of a science fiction movie. I mean, it's spectacular is what it is. So, the key, though, is what happens. When the cherubim departed, they lifted their wings, rose up, skip on down, and they stood still at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of God of Israel hovered over them. And then eventually what happens is it leaves. So how should that, I mean, there are a lot of things communicated in pictures. You know, just like the one of go around with a bag on your back and maybe people will understand that we're going to be on a trip. Well, when they see God leave the temple, the threshold of the temple, what's that to communicate, do you think? You're on your own. That's exactly it. You're on your own. I'm not going to be here anymore, and my presence is not going to be felt among you, because my presence goes where people want my presence. You have chosen to not do that. So the glory of the Lord departs the threshold of the temple, and then Ezekiel says that what he saw at the temple was the same as what he saw at the river, at the Chebar River in Babylon. Once again, Ezekiel explains to the people why they are being punished. So what do I mean by that? It's a generalization. But they're going to be punished. They're going to be taken out of the land. It's amazing to me that God really wants to make it clear when it should be obvious. But he just keeps repeating it. Let me tell you why you are going to be going away, that I'm going to remove you from the kingdom. So look at verse 1 through 13 of chapter 11. Now it says, "Now the Spirit lifted me up and brought me to the east gate of the Lord's house, which faced eastward. Behold, there were 25 men at the entrance of the gate, and among them I saw these guys here that no one seems to know exactly who they are, but they were leaders of some kind in the temple." Then in verse 2, it says, "Then he said to me, Son of man, these are the men who devise wrongdoing and give evil advice, not near to build, this time is not near to build houses." Anybody got any ideas of why that is presented that way? This is no time to build houses, these guys advise. It would seem to me, if I understand that what's happening here is they are presented to us as people who are not good leaders. And they don't give good advice. So what might you think that means? When they are condemned because they give evil advice in the city and they say, the time is not near to build houses. Now, remember, when they went over to Babylon, what were they told to do? Build houses. So when it's here, now notice here, it says, "This city is the pot and we are the meat. Therefore prophesy against them. Prophesy, Son of man." Now, the phrase there, "the city is the pot and we are the meat," they're talking about themselves. What do you think that might mean? Yes, go ahead, Carol.
Well, they're still thinking there are the choices of Israelites,
Yeah,
and that they're going to be somehow protected and they're going to be able to stay in Jerusalem. Because of the bad counsel they were getting from the leaders,
right.
who were completely polluted,
Yeah.
they believed those leaders instead of God. So they thought they were going to be okay.
In fact, we end up finding out that one of the things that the leaders are telling them is, you know why things are going so bad and why things look like they're going to be so destructive? Well, it's because God doesn't care about us. He doesn't even know we're here anymore. You ever heard that before? When people say, where's God for me? Where is he when we need him? It's a very natural thing. But these guys, they were perfectly happy. This city is the pot and we're the meat. We are really something. We are really special. So again, this is a reason presented for why they are to be judged. So what's so bad about that? It kind of gets back to what I've been trying to understand about what actually are they condemned with doing? What's that? Not honoring God. I think that's a good example. Anything else? Yeah, it's they just are smug and they just don't treat him with any respect whatsoever. Now, in this particular setting, it seems sort of a storybook, and I'm not sure that we connect with it as much as we should. But generally speaking, that the people who reject God in our world, that's the attitude that they have toward God. They don't have any respect for God. What's that? That's right. And so they flaunt it, and they not only tease the people who are there, they tease God. They're trying to tease God. So that's why when I look at the various laws, because that's how we understand what sin is, that a lot of times we focus, I mean, I think rightly so to a certain extent, the temple was very, very important, and they had to do things correctly with the temple, didn't they? But it was more than that. They just didn't respect God at all. And these are who? These are crazy idolaters who know nothing about God, right? No, they're Israelites, and they know. And it's one of those things where we're at a loss sometimes, because you hear about someone who loses their faith, and you go, well, how did that happen? How did that happen to him? Or how did that happen to her? Well, for most of us, we don't know everything that's going on in their lives, so we don't really know what's happening. But the point is that these are individuals who are leaders, and they should be taking people in a more appropriate direction. That is doing what? This is what God wants us to do. So that's what our responsibility is as teachers, and as elders. And we are to try to get across the message of the love of God, and then that God is a just God, and He has a definition of sin that may not agree with what everybody else happens to think about what it is. So, God introduces these people to Ezekiel, and then look at verse 13. This is kind of an interesting reaction. Daniel Stitt, would you read it, verse 13 of chapter 11?
It came to pass, while I was prophesying, that Pelatiah the son of Benadiah died. And I fell down on my face and cried out with a loud voice and said, Ah, Lord God, will you make a full end of the remnant of Israel?
Okay, now you can kind of run in different directions on this as to actually how you can look at it to where it's obviously a criticism. Any ideas about what happens to him? He's met these leaders, and he was teaching, he was prophesying, and then one of them just dies. And then what's his reaction? What does it say there, folks? In the middle of verse 11. He fell on his face. He's very, I don't know what you would call it. Is he angry? Is he saying, oh boy, is this the way it's going to go? I mean, is anybody going to be left around here? You're going to kill everybody? Anybody okay with that one? Does that one make sense? Or any other ideas?
It seems like he had some sort of respect for that person.
Yeah, it was like, okay, I mean, this is the sense I get. Yeah, I realize he and his buddies are quite messes, and they're really lousy leaders. But come on, we're gonna have something left, when it's time, because he does promise that there is also, despite all this, and this is where the greatness and merciful nature of God comes in, and that is when he goes ahead and tells the people, yes, I'm going to put you out. I'm going to do what I said I was going to do, but guess what? I'm going to bring you back.
So maybe he doesn't expect that this guy, because, he knows this guy, so maybe he feels like, well, it shouldn't be him. I mean, there's going to be a remnant, but, he should have been in the remnant.
Yeah, it may have been his impression, because, maybe he doesn't know these characters all that well. He's just been introduced, and, they've been introduced to the leaders of the temple, and they're thinking, man, if this guy can't get it done, well, then who's going to get it done? But amazingly, they're told that God's going to bring them back. Now, this is where it's important for you to understand your Old Testament books, that sometimes people will go, oh yeah, maybe this is talking about when the Lord's going to bring them back to the land. That's what people said back in the late 50s, that's what was happening. But if you follow this in the Old Testament, what's happening? When you read Nehemiah, when you read Ezra, that was the restoration. The people came back then. And again, we kind of slip over that, but the reality is that's when it happened. And so they were there, and they were there, of course, because of that, despite what the Greeks may have done or what the Romans may have done. They're there for what significant reason? To be there for Christ, to bring Christ to the place where he's supposed to be. So, yes, they get restored, but this is one of the problems, I think, sometimes with dealing with Old Testament prophecy. We get real anxious to sort of want to go out here somewhere when it's just right there. And it's actually going to happen a generation or two later, but they're going to go back. And Nehemiah is going to rebuild the walls, and there they're going to be. So, there is going to be a remnant. And it starts out with that person with the white shirt identifying these individuals as being the ones who at least are willing to stand up against these false idolaters. But they're going to be able to come back. Go ahead, Lupe.
I have a question about the temple. Which temple was this?
Well, this was the temple. They hadn't completely restored the Temple of Solomon yet. Okay, that gets destroyed, I think, in 520 something. So we're not there yet. So it's the temple as we know it. But what's going to happen? It's going to get destroyed.
And it's located where?
It's there in Jerusalem. Yeah. Okay? All right. So go ahead and try to press ahead as much as you can with the next 3 or 4 chapters after chapter 11 and 12. And again, I want you to try to get in the mood of thinking the way God thinks and what's he trying to accomplish. And again, there's this pattern, and I've mentioned this many, many times before, that when you're reading the prophets, it's very much about this theme. People are rebelling against God, they are going to be punished for it, and they're going to be taken out of the land. That's pretty much the way it is. And then when they decide they're going to do what's right, and some guys get the energy to get back and go. I mean, when Nehemiah and that group, when they went, I mean, there weren't a lot of people who were anxious to go. But eventually they did. But God promised, I'm going to have you go there. Yeah, Mitch?
One of the things maybe we can learn from this is, left to our own, by just giving God's law, we're just going to degrade like these people. And so what was needed was Christ.
Yeah.
And so, I don't think man is capable of keeping, man isn't capable of keeping God's laws by himself. And this nation is a great example of that.
Yeah, I mean, there are...
Of how important Jesus is, right?
Yeah.
We can criticize him all we want, but idolatry at that time was very much practiced. Not so much practiced that people worship.
No, it was
wood, right? But
just like we were talking about eating and... Go ahead.
yeah, so what we worship today are different things.
Yeah.
Left to ourselves, we're gonna just fall in line just like the world. So.
Right, but I would say we don't give up. We keep trying to do the best we can to encourage ourselves to try to do the right thing. Yeah, we're going to sin. Yeah, we're going to do what? We're certainly going to do things, but do you completely rebel against God? Not everybody did it then. But in the end, I mean, we do discover, just like Mitch says, that, in terms of being right with God, we can't do it on our own because we don't do it for the most part. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.